Hello everyone, Cleeful here, and I'm back with another topic that I've wanted to cover for a while ever since I started the channel. I've just haven't been quite sure how best to approach the video, as evident by my past 5 or 6 attempts to script or otherwise guide myself through what I want to showcase. But I think I finally have it, so I'm finally putting it all to work in video format. Today, we are going to be covering the crit stats of Genshin Impact and the math behind them. There are a number of topics that I want to touch on in this video, and they will be as follows. The Golden Ratio. What is average crit multiplier and why is it relevant to you? Why crit stats are both the weakest and strongest stats in the game. When is crit not the best stat to focus on? And throughout the rest of those topics, cover how best to focus on your stats to maximize crit when relevant, given the RNG nature of artifacts. Now, before I get into the video proper, there is but one topic that I want to very briefly cover. That topic is what I mean when I say investment within the video and how that plays into how artifacts rolls their substats. For artifact substats, I'm not going to be getting too technical, but do understand that artifacts of 4-star or 5-star rarity can roll one of 4 tiers of rolls in each substat, as shown on the screen. This is important to note as it makes it a lot easier to simulate stat distribution and makes it easy to focus on one specific number as a baseline. That baseline I will be using is tier 2 rolls, keeping the numbers above what they could be minimally, while keeping them below the average of what is possible. For investment, I'm referencing the total investment you have into any stats, or stats as a whole. Since in all graphs in this video will, unless otherwise stated, have the minimum of a crit hat and an attack percent hourglass, I will mainly be using investment to reference how many substat rolls there are in total, or into a particular substat. I will reference this as, in theory, with perfect artifacts, you can have a total of up to 38 substat rolls spread out between attack percent, critical chance, and critical damage, but it does vary based on RNG, so we will be covering most of those different variances later on into the video. Brief disclaimer, I will be focusing on attack percent versus the crit stats for optimization and math. Since most places you can obtain damage percent, you can't trade the damage percent for crit stats, and in the places you can, the trade is situational and generally falls in favor of damage percent. As such, I will be omitting damage percent from the maths of this video, and the goblet, in all the tests run, was of a damage percent variety. So, what is the Golden Ratio? The Golden Ratio, in the instance of crit maths for all video games where you equally raise both crit chance and crit damage, is to maintain the ratio between your stats equally to that of the ratio that the stats are obtained. This makes it easy with Genshin to figure out, because its crit main stat artifacts, crit substats, crit weapon stats, and other sources of crit all follow the same pattern of obtainment, 1 to 2. The ratio we are talking about in question is 1 to 2. Here, you can see that ratio in action. The dark green highlighted cells are the best improvement of average crit multiplier for the number of crit stat investments. Note the light green cells represent 2 nodes of equal increase, and the dark blue highlights the direction that each cell is compared to for equal investment, as one stat investment out of crit chance and put back into crit damage is still an equal number of steps taken into total investment. This graph uses a 5 crit chance to 10 crit damage growth to make it easy to follow. Moving to a new graph, we can see that it is like the older one, but has some new additions and changes over the previous one. First, we are now using Tier 2 substat rolls rather than arbitrary numbers. And secondly, we are only highlighting values every 2 substat rolls. You will notice that there are 3 different lines this time rather than 2. The dark green line, as always, is following the optimal 1:2 ratio as close as possible. The black line is instead following a 1:2 substat ratio roll, so we're perfectly rolling into the substats, but since we don't start at the golden 1:2 ratio, we're winding up with different numbers. And that the blue line is how, again, we compare stats at equal levels of investment. Note that these 2 particular graphs we have shown assume no crit hat. To better visualize what exactly this spreadsheet graph thing here showcases, I've compiled it into an actual chart, shown here. The blue and red lines represent the percentage increase per 2 rolls of the previously shown green and black lines respectively, and the green and yellow lines show the average crit multiplier over the total rolls. You can see, though the total difference between those values are minimal, there is still a gap that amounts to about a % to 2 difference between the 2, visible in this graph here. As we can see, the difference isn't massive, but it does still exist. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about the golden ratio a bit further and the intent behind it. Firstly, there is only one golden ratio in Genshin Impact, and it exists between crit chance and crit damage. There exists no singular golden ratio, quote unquote, between attack percent and the crit stats. So, if you have been told otherwise, it is either uninformed misinformation or information obtained in flawed data tests that have fallen into what I call the attack percent trap, which I will be covering later into the video. Also, the golden ratio is not a take it as gospel, end all be all, you must do this methodology. It is intended as a guidepost for you to figure out the best way to gear up your unit. As I have always stated, Goblet is the most valuable offset piece, and the Circlet is always equipped last. This is so that you can best pick crit damage or chance main stats to bridge the gap you have from the 1 to 2 that will exist in the RNG you get from rolling your substats. This gives you the most flexibility to make the decision you want in distributing your crit chance and damage while not asking for godly RNG to roll you the right substats on another piece of equipment. Moving on, to briefly cover the theory crafting stat known as average crit multiplier, it's a value we get by multiplying the critical hit damage by the critical hit chance. This enables us to provide an average increase in a unit's damage so that we can quantify the capable strength of different critical chance, critical damage stat ratios. Unfortunately, with how critical hit chance is an RNG stat, it is quite possible for you to find real-world scenarios where you might witness a higher than or lower than number of crits compared to what your critical hit chance is. However, that does not remove the value that average crit multiplier brings to theory crafting, as binomial distribution calculations show that for most cases it's not a massive disparity between those different possible outcomes, and that it all averages out quite well with how most units aren't only landing 2, 3, or 4 attacks in any one given endgame combat scenario. What relevance this holds is greater than you might think when we link it back to the previous data that has been shown and finally conglomerate that into a graph that also contains attack percent. It is here that we will get to see why crit stats can be as overpowering as they can. Starting off with pure substat rolls, that means we are not including main stats still. We can see early on that attack percent has a huge value advantage over crit. but it also does start to heavily taper off. We can compare this to what we saw earlier and what we currently see with crit, where it does initially taper off, but then it starts gaining value over the investment. Looking at this, you would assume that there would be a lot of value in attack percent, and you would be correct. However, this does not take into account all the real-world situations, which will heavily change the lay of the land. Keeping with the current graph we have, but adding in an attack percent hourglass and a crit chance circlet, giving us these new base stats, we can see that a large portion of attack percent's initial spike has been removed, bringing the highest peak down by about 25%. However, we can see that instead of falling down, by adding the crit chance circlet, we instead get a notable increase over starting with nothing. This initial dip we start with is still there as we need to reach the 1-to-2 ratio, but we start from a higher place and dip over less rolls, and then reach our peak sooner enough that we can actually get there with just substat rolls, as where you can reach with a total number of possible rolls is 34 rolls split in amongst your crit chance and crit damage. However, even this is not truly indicative of where one actually starts. Since artifacts start with substats already on them, you technically start with substat rolls already rolled. Starting substat rolls can include up to 9 starting crit subs, assuming a crit circlet of some kind, and up to 4 attack percent subs, assuming an attack percent timepiece. If we make an assumption that you start with 2 rolls in both crits and 3 in attack percent, we can make a true real-world graph. This nets a final graph that looks like this. With the attack percent hourglass taking the largest cut of the attack percent pie, the attack percent line doesn't drop as significantly as it did prior, though it still does drop a bit. However, when you couple that with the fact that the crit line, even with only a total of 4 out of the 9 possible starting crit rolls, increases a lot, and breaches an initial 2% margin, narrowing the gap between initial first roll values even further. To put this into perspective, with no main stats, the first roll of attack percent is worth over double that of what crit gives you. With main stats though, that gap narrows to only a 37% increase versus crit. This is a very considerable gap close and shows how much of the total value of attack percent one attack percent main stat gives. Going to the example we had with fairly reservative substat initial rolls, the gap narrows again to only a 16% increase of the first attack percent roll over crit. Note that these increases are specific damage increases rather than overall damage increases, mainly due to the fact if I showed overall damage increases, we'd be talking the differences of like 0.5% here of your total damage, which just comes from the fact that we're adding 3% crit chance or 4.5% attack. It's really small numbers beget really small damage increases. It's only once you get 20 or 30 crit rolls or 20 to 30 attack rolls where you see really large numbers, which we will be able to see with the last batch of graphs. This last batch of graphs will show the different total modifiers. By total modifier, I mean how much of a total effective damage increase the previous examples had. What these will show is how much of an increase in damage there is to be had, and where the actual cross points are between the two possible options. First up, we have the no main stats graph. You can note that though the crit line eventually does start catching back up to the attack percent line, it never does cross it. Not even adding in a crit main stat helmet will fix this problem. Now if we compare this graph to the one having the main stats of both attack percent and crit chance, we get a much different looking graph. We can see that at low investment, attack percent does win out over crit. However, this doesn't last forever, as you can see the crit line exceed the attack percent one. Now, what is relevant here is not what the values are on the graphs, but instead the spacing between the two lines, as that is the difference between the two options, and that is what we're looking at here. As you can see, the crit versus attack percent line does its little jig and does cross over, but there is still a notable gap beforehand as well as after. This gap will decrease quite substantially the moment you gain any initial attack percent or crit rolls. To prove this point, we can put the 3 attack percent, 4 crit initial substat rolls option we had from before, and showcase another graph. Though the crossover point hasn't really moved much, the area between the attack percent and the crit line in the initial 20 or so rolls has heavily shrunk, and this trend continues the more the initial substats you get. Though crit never completely overtakes attack percent, it does shut it down enough that only the highest base attacks demand much of any rolls beyond the 4 initial attack percent rolls, and the highest of this, being Diluc with a 5-star weapon, only wants a total of 8 at the most optimal endgame scenario. Now, I also promised to touch on when it is best not to focus on crit stats, and that is a topic that, while writing this video, I found it to be a large enough topic to be its own whole separate video, on the specifics as to why it might not be the best stat to use, and what value Elemental Mastery, Energy Recharge, or other stats might have over it, and the situations where you will find them more important to obtain or use. As such, I'll be saving that in depth for another video in the future, but I will touch on some of those situations briefly in my conclusion, as most of those situations want a heavier focus on attack percent for the DPS side of those characters, which I guess is as good a segue as any to the conclusions and recommendations I want to make, of which there are more than a couple. To again touch on the golden 1-to-2 ratio briefly, it is nothing more than a value guideline. Choosing between 2 artifact sets, one with more DPS subs will generally average higher DPS, so long as it doesn't heavily skew your crit ratio between the 2 layouts of gear. To layman's terms, my takeaway from the 1-to-2 ratio, understand the following. 1. Take away the knowledge of the 1-to-2 ratio so you can make informed decisions. 2. To take as much control over your stats as you can. When possible, find and level the other 4 artifacts of your set and weapon for your character. You can then reference your crit ratio from there and determine the better choice between a crit chance and crit damage circlet. 3. Understand that there can be cases where a generally considered inferior weapon can wind up being superior if it happens to balance out lopsided crit stats in your build. Do note that this is a case-by-case basis, but it has been known to happen. 4. The fluidity of the numbers means you really have to go and calculate your specific case for yourself. You can do that by joining my Discord, link in the description down below, where I will have a tool or 2 posted in the coming days to make the process as easy and painless as possible. I would like to give a brief mention to the average crit multiplier here, but I can't go too far into it as it would run this video far too long. In truth, it would probably fit better as a short-length deep dive video in and of itself, which I might make. Let me know in the comments down below if that would be something you guys would be interested in. But for a TLDR, binomial distribution allows it to be a relatively very accurate representation of the DPS increase crit can give you. Now, moving on to the attack percent versus crit side of things, before I move on to my recommendations and conclusions of this clusterduck of a topic, I want to touch on something first. Remember, artifacts come with initial substat rolls. These add to the total number of rolls you can have, but can't all be designated to one stat. As such, even on a level 20 unit, an attack percent hourglass plus 4 attack percent initial substats will still typically be the minimum you want on a DPS character, as you could never put those stats into crit. In truth, this can be said about all other stats, though notable ones are Energy Recharge and Element Mastery. Do make note that for my conclusions and recommendations that the recommendations I will be making are going to be generalist and will not have many, if any, ratios of attack percent to crit, as these can change per character and weapon choice on top of the relevant levels of each of those items. And B, if you have specific questions about any combinations of main stats, substats, artifact sets, or weapons, the best practice would be to find a calculator to calculate that stuff, and you should be able to find one in my Discord in the coming days. Again, link in the description down below. So, what are my recommendations or takeaways from this information overload of a video? For my first recommendation, if you are building a damage-oriented unit who does not need much energy recharge, or a unit with split scaling, especially if they have a close to 50-50 split in the damage dealt from that split scaling, you should be aiming for as much crit as possible. Do note that you should not overload crit chance past 100% if you can help it, as anything past 100% does nothing and does result in notable dips in DPS increases. For my second recommendation, for units that want high energy recharge, if they need an energy recharge hourglass, 9 out of 10 times an attack percent circlet is going to be the larger DPS increase. Also, the attack percent to crit substat behavior falls much more into the take what you can get category, although you generally favor more attack percent than you otherwise normally would. Do note that an attack percent weapon does skew this heavily back in favor of crit. If the character can instead make do with energy recharge substats, you are most likely still going to want a crit chance hat. However, the value of attack percent substats versus crit substats is going to change based on how much energy recharge you do require. To figure that out exactly, it's best to either go calculate it yourself, or you can join my Discord and the Kleeful community, and we'll try to help you out the best we can. And for my last recommendation, or my third recommendation, technically the same thing, we're going to be talking about the healers. You can generally consider the crit substats on healers as a do not roll past initial substat stat. Crit still has value as an initial stat roll, as it does provide extra damage that you otherwise would not be able to obtain. However, as you generally are running an energy recharge hourglass and a utility circlet and or goblet, attack percent has a heavy advantage by not having an attack percent main stat. And since attack percent, as we've seen in the previous graphs, when starting at 0% has an incredible amount of initial value over crit, you're never going to wind up having enough crit to make it stronger than just rolling heavily into attack percent. Note this is more for your healing units like Bennett, Diona, Barbara, and to an extent, Noelle, who utilize HP or defense rather than attack. But for units such as Jean or Chi-Chi, it's completely blown out of proportion because you're typically going to be using 1 if not 2 attack percent main stats on them in order to make their heals stronger. So they more follow their own rules that are a combination of recommendation 1 and 2. For the final caveats, none of the graphs in my video have taken into account possible ascension stats, weapon substats, or buffs from other units. I also did not include any crit stat weighting, such as higher value crit damage for aimed headshots, or higher value crit chance for passive effects like Klee's Ascension 4, or the Favonius weapon passives. Future video topic on this in particular incoming shortly. These can be weighted, but that weight is too subjective to be quantified properly in this particular video, so I'm going to avoid it for now and leave it for another time. And with that honestly does it for the immediate recommendations, as anything more than this is not going to be applicable enough to general thought processes to be of much value. Remember that nothing I say here is 100% gospel, and there will always be cases where what I say that in general usually works might not. Always do your due diligence and find calculators or ask around in the theory crafting discords to find the answer that best fits you. Because at the end of the day, artifact substat rolls are 100% RNG. we as a player base have very little control over what we get for substats other than slamming our face against the wall. It's why I recommend you get your crit hat last, as we can control that when it comes down to trying to keep to the 1-to-2 ratio as much as possible. It's also the same case with attack percent versus crit. Don't follow it religiously. Don't not use a much better artifact because it invests too much into attack percent. The most gospel thing you can get out of this video is that crit is very strong, attack still has value, but at the end of the day, you should go out, find a calculator, and calculate it yourself. It really is the only way to be 100% sure you're getting the most out of what you yourself has, as the intent of this video, again, is not to put you off attack percent, but is instead to drive home the fact and value that crit brings so much more to the table when heavily invested in. Now, if you do have any further questions, it would be best to bring them to my Discord so that they can be brought to my attention, and if you have immediate questions, you can come to my Twitch, twitch.tv/KleefulFrames, and ask me there when I am live. I will be going live at 11 PM EST, or about 3 hours once this video goes live, if it goes live at the appropriate time. As always, I hope you found this video informative, and that it wasn't too much of an information overload. Do let me know how I did in the comment section, as I do still check them from time to time. The positive feedback I've been getting really has gone a long way. Make sure you also do hit the subscribe and bell button so that you can catch my latest upcoming videos, as I will be piloting a new short but sweet video series in the coming days, as well as making that Xiao combo video that people keep asking me for. And, as always, I will look forward to seeing you in the next video. I'm KleefulFrames, and I thank you very much for watching.